Japan's ruling coalition has fallen short of securing a majority in the upper house in a crucial parliamentary election this past Sunday. So what does this mean? We tell you on Press Perspective today. Hello and welcome to Press Perspective. It's Monday, July 21st here in South Korea. I'm Min Sunhee. Today we touch upon the results of a key parliamentary election in neighboring Japan and their broader implications. For this, I have Celio Fioretti with French daily Le Croix here in the studio. Celio, welcome.
Glad to be here.
I also have Walter Sim with Singaporean daily, the Straits Times over in Tokyo. Walter, it's great to have you on.
Nice to be here as well.
Right, Walter, we will start with you. Let's begin with the results of Sunday's upper house election and its political implications for the ruling coalition.
Right. I do think that the result obviously marks a rejection of establishment politics, especially among young voters of the ruling Liberal Democratic Party and its coalition partner Komeito. And this result would definitely turn up the pressure on Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba. So Mr. Ishiba has insisted that he will remain in office. He said so yesterday after the exit polling results were out, and he said so again at the press conference this afternoon. And the reasoning behind it, he says, is to avoid creating a political vacuum at a time when Japan is facing many external uncertainties. This would include America's reciprocal tariffs as well as the volatile geopolitical environment. But he is also pushing this glass half full perspective that I personally don't think is very convincing, and I'm sure many in the LDP do not think is convincing either. So he's saying that despite the dismal performance, and even without this majority in both the lower and upper house of the Diet, he says that he has to remain in power because he feels responsible for the voters of the LDP, given that the party is still the largest in relative terms in the parliament. So, but despite of what he says, I think the result definitely portends political instability. It was pointed out earlier in the show that it's the first time that the LDP does not have a majority in either chamber of parliament. And yes, this also shows that the ruling coalition holds very few cards because Mr. Ishiba, just to pass legislation, he will either have to expand the ruling coalition, which is an idea that a lot of opposition parties are not on board with, or he also has to work with the opposition on an ad hoc policy by policy basis just to secure the numbers necessary to get policies passed in parliament. He also has to stand firm against calls from his rivals within the LDP itself, including his runner-up in last year's presidential election, former Economic Security Minister Sanae Takaichi, who has come out to say last week that the LDP as it is right now has no backbone. And so it's a kind of a norm in Japan for LDP leaders to resign after presiding over an electoral bloodbath. And so Mr. Ishiba, in standing firm, is kind of going against precedent. And so I think it really begs the question of how long his position is sustainable. But if he does stay on, and if he can withstand all these pressures, no national election is due until 2028, and the LDP is only due for a leadership election in 2027. And so if he can, withstand these pressures for the time being, I think he is set to stay.
Right. Walter, what has been the public response to the election result? I mean, was this largely expected?
Yes, I do think it's largely expected, especially given how in Japan the media has really been on top with media opinion surveys and forecasts of how the election would turn out. But I think one thing that's very interesting is the unusually high public interest in the upper house election. So according to the figures that were released just today, it shows a turnout of 58.51%, which is remarkably high for an upper house election that kind of has no direct bearing on forming the government. It also comes despite polling day being in the middle of a 3-day long weekend. So I think this kind of shows how the public was galvanized to cast their ballots, partially because of the rise of populist parties that kind of have given voice to the bread and butter grievances of the public. And there is also a looming general unhappiness with Mr. Ishiba and his passivity, his lack of policy breakthrough since he took office last October.
Right. Keeping in mind the latest political developments in neighboring Japan, Celio, what potential policy changes, if any, in the neighboring country are likely to be closely watched by South Korea, do you think?
Well, first of all, the trade policy. We mentioned that Japan is under pressure from Washington under the Trump tariff of 25%, especially on rice and automobiles. And Tokyo has been almost wrecked in the past negotiation, gaining almost nothing out of it. If Japan ruling coalition loses its majority, ongoing trade negotiation with Washington could stall and be delayed even further. For South Korea, which compete with Japan in many export sectors, this could redefine the regional trade dynamics, giving maybe a slight advantage to Seoul if Korea managed to get a deal with Trump in any sorts. But this could also, on the other hand, hamper the idea of making a united front, a united Asian front against Trump tariff, to block any sort of cooperation between Tokyo and Seoul, to give a definite answer, a common answer to Trump on Asia. And second, it's the immigration policy. Japan has taken around 1 million foreign workers to address labor shortages due to the lack of births. And it's a problem we see in Korea too, even worse, relatively speaking. And in this election, what is really striking is the far-right party growing louder with it's called the Sanseito Party, which a very blunt anti-immigration policy. South Korea would also struggle with the same problem of immigration, that will need immigration in the years to come to face these labor shortages, could be impacted right now by maybe a shift in workplace mobility. Maybe people that wanted to work in Japan might shift to Korea because they feel they're not really well welcomed anymore there. So that could be a first consequences. But later, maybe people in Korea might also start to have some problem with immigration and mimic what the Sanseito Party is doing right now in Japan. But that's maybe for the 10 years later. We'll see how the situation develops. And finally, the also important takeaway from this election is the defense spending. Prime Minister Ishiba, if he maintains his power, he's expected to pursue a record high defense budget in Japan, and that would raise concern in Seoul, particularly given the historical grievance between the two countries. But also nowadays, Tokyo and Seoul are cooperating on defense matter regarding North Korea, for example. So maybe there's also room to continue this policy of working better together against a common threat that is North Korea.
Right. And speaking about the grievances between the two countries, South Korea and Japan, that is, just last week, Seoul condemned Tokyo's claim over Korea's Dokdo islets. Now, this claim was carried in Japan's annual white paper, which also referred to South Korea as an important regional partner. Celio, do you believe that global geopolitics will perhaps help these two countries to move beyond their past conflict to perhaps a future of constructive collaboration?
Well, indeed, the Dokdo-Takeshima issue remains a deeply symbolic dispute between South Korea and Japan. And in this annual defense white paper last week, it reaffirmed its claim over the islet. And that is quite usual coming from Japan, but it's what is really new this year is calling South Korea an important regional partner. That's very interesting because this contradiction highlights a broader tension. Can historical grievance coexist with present-day strategic cooperation? In today's geopolitical climate, the stakes are high. Both countries face common challenges from the threat of China, North Korea, and also the global pressure to reduce dependence on U.S. security and U.S. economy. In this context, we've seen over the past years, closer ties between Seoul and Tokyo are not just desirable, they're needed. Whether on missile defense coordination, economic security, even on technology, AI and semiconductor supply chains, both countries need to work together because just working alone, being isolated from one another, will not help them survive the competition against bigger threats like China. But for that to happen, both countries need to separate maybe symbolic disputes, historical disputes, from strategic concerns. That doesn't mean forgetting the past, but it requires, I think, some pragmatic leadership. On the Dokdo issue, for example, and I'm really only talking about that, not the sexual labor or forced labor during the war. But on that, I think it's an issue that hasn't seen many progress over the decades we've been talking about this, and I think it might be required to both countries to agree to disagree. This issue will not be resolved, but let's move on to something that could help to fix other situations. And I think that's really what the two countries are trying to do now, focus on what can be improved, move on something that can be beneficial for both countries, and maybe talk about the past a bit later.
Right, which essentially, of course, it's easier said than done, though. Walter, back in neighbouring Japan, domestic concerns, including inflation and immigration, as Celio mentioned, are believed to have strongly shaped voter sentiment. First of all, how severe is inflation there?
Right. If we look at the figure by itself, inflation stood at 3.3% as of June. But I do think that figure alone tells just part of the story, especially considering how Japan has suffered from years and decades of low inflation. So we also see a lot of media reports focusing on how Japanese companies are promising the highest average wage growth in 34 years at an average of 5.25%. So those reports by themselves also paint a very over positive picture of the Japanese economy. But what I think has not really been focused through these economic data, economic numbers, is the reality that real wages have been shrinking for 5 months and counting, and households really feel much poorer than ever before. So this issue becomes even more dire if we consider rice prices, for instance, and we know how rice is a staple for the Asian diet, especially the Japanese. And so rice prices are nearly double what they were last year. And so this has obviously had an impact on household consumption. So I think with this in mind, economic crisis, the cost of living crisis, was really one major element, as you pointed out, behind the election. And this has kind of fueled an element of populism as well. So the ruling coalition were promising voters through this vague campaign pledge that they were going to give cash handouts of 20,000 yen per voter, whilst the opposition was promising sweeping consumption tax cuts of varying degrees. And of course, this would be detrimental to Japan in the long run if we think about issues such as its fiscal health and the impact on big picture, big ticket expenditures such as social welfare, defense, or education.
Right. Walter, I'd also like to touch upon something that Celio mentioned earlier. Could you explain the anti-foreigner sentiment there in the US? I mean, I understand there are scholars in Japan who have shared concerns about growing xenophobia in Japan.
Right. I kind of think that it's kind of related to the cost of living crisis that I talked about earlier. And I kind of think that this sentiment probably wouldn't have been so acute if household consumption sentiment was more robust. But it's kind of the ruling government's failure to fully address these concerns, and coupled with its kind of old school way of campaigning that focused on street campaign rallies at the expense of devoting more resources on social media, that has given far-right upstart parties. Celio mentioned Sanseito, which has been very online savvy and very adept at using social media to draw the attention of young voters and galvanize their support. So I think that were pretty much the factors behind Sanseito's meteoric rise as a political party. It grew from just one seat that was contested to 14 seats in the upper house out of 55 candidates that were fielded. And I think that was a pretty high success rate. And Sanseito kind of campaigned on this Japanese first campaign slogan. And it was spewing claims that, Japan was becoming and I quote, economic colony. Japan was suffering from a silent invasion of foreigners. And this kind of plays to the gallery when voters are feeling worse off than before, when many Japanese citizens are taught from young that the country is homogeneous, and when, the passport rate, the percentage of Japanese that holds passport is at a low 17%. So it's pretty much an inward-looking country, and we have foreigners coming in, snapping up real estate, and Japan is also facing a serious over-tourism problem due to the weak yen, and voters, as they scream and save, they just have to look around and see an influx of foreign tourists spending lavishly, going for expensive meals. So it kind of, hammers home the harsh reality for them and kind of gives Sanseto the space to drive such anti-foreign sentiment. So all this kind of feeds into the impression, and I think it is a cautionary tale that regional governments might want to heed, and kind of in kind of preventing this anti-foreign sentiment from taking root before it erupts like it has in Japan. So the LDP has been put on the back foot. And last week, in a bid to curb Sanseto's momentum, it kind of launched this so-called cross-agency control tower to deal with foreigner-related issues, even though, not much details have been provided as to what its actual mandate is.
Right. And speaking about the presence of foreigners within the community here in this part of the world, as you mentioned earlier, Celio, immigration is also being proposed as one possible option to addressing South Korea's own population crisis. That being said, the UPI recently published an article based on findings by a research entity here in the country. It claims that we will witness a frightening fall with regard to a population over the next 100 years. Could you tell us a bit about that particular coverage?
Exactly. The numbers are staggering. According to a recent study by the Korean Peninsula Population Institute, South Korea population could shrink to just 7.5 million by the next century. That's less than 15% of today's population. Even the median projection put the number at only around 11 million. And the trend is accelerating by South Korea being the country with the lowest birth rate in the world, which currently sits at around 0.7 children per woman. Now we have to be careful with projection. They're not totally reliable, but it gives an idea, a trend of where we're going. And the demographic freefall poses a serious threat to the nation's economic future, the labor force and welfare system, especially with an aging population. By the next century, there could be 140 seniors for every 100 working age Korean. So that's dramatically shifting the dependency ratio between the two populations. So what is the solution? As we mentioned, immigration is on the table currently in more and more debates, in political debate. Well, traditionally, immigration is not very common in Korea. It's really a recent phenomenon. Korea now doesn't feel it no longer have the choice. If they want to replace the labor shortages, the working population, they will have to require from foreign workers to support the pension system and bring in also younger demographic and new families that maybe will have babies here in Korea. But immigration itself won't solve the crisis. It must come with social integration, labor policies, to integrate better the immigration. And coming back from Japan, we see also that now there's a lot of tension, xenophobia against immigration, and societies, Korean and Japanese societies are quite similar in how they are recently having immigrants. The country is not really used to it, so it brings tension. And the consequences of that is like this far-right party are pushing now for anti-immigration laws. That is, in the case of Japan, with a low population and shrinking population, is shooting yourself in the foot because you will need people anyway. That's how the economy is going to survive if you don't make more babies. So immigration is not a silver bullet. It will not solve anything, but it's something to consider and to consider wisely to better integrate and make sure it can be sustainable in the country, integrate the immigrants and make the country sustainable and keep the economy growing.
Right, for sure. I'm still trying to wrap my head around the figure you gave me. So 100 years from now, the population here in the country is going to be about 7 million people. But of course, we have to be very careful about such projections. Walter, one question to you. With regard to Japan's tariff talks with the Trump administration, where is that standing as we talk?
Well, there really isn't much to note. I was hoping to give positive news on this front, but no, there really isn't much to note other than the fact that Economic Revitalization Minister Ryosuke Akazawa, who is Mr. Ishiba's chief trade negotiator, has departed for his 8th visit to Washington earlier today for the 8th round of ministerial talks. So it was notable that on the campaign trail, Mr. Ishiba really hardened his rhetoric against the US. He was saying things that Japan should not be taken for fools, Japan should not be underestimated. But now that the election is done and dusted, it's still kind of unclear as to whether Mr. Ishiba will back down and offer concessions now. But to be honest, I do think that that looks pretty much unlikely, especially when Mr. Trump wants concessions on autos and rice, as Celio mentioned earlier. And these are pretty much sacred cows for Japan, and that kind of gives Mr. Ishiba very little room to maneuver without upsetting traditional lobby groups. And so I think at this point, it still looks exceptionally unlikely that Japan will manage to win any reprieve or respite from the 25% reciprocal tariff from August 1st, unless, of course, Mr. Akazawa pulls off a miracle on this current trip.
Right. And Celio, what has been the impact of Mr. Trump's trade protectionism, if you will, on perhaps the regional debate over globalism versus nationalism, do you think?
Well, I think Donald Trump return to a hardline protectionism has sent shockwaves across Asia, reigniting tension between economic nationalism and global integration. Since taking office, he reimposed tariff, as we talked a lot here in Korea and in Japan. And this America First approach is clearly pushing Asian economies to become more self-reliant, but not in an isolationist way. Instead, we're seeing what analysts call a strategic decoupling. Countries like South Korea and Japan are trying to reduce their dependency on US economy, sending less exports to US, and maybe reactivate local partnership in Asia or looking for new partnership in Europe, in Africa. So it's a sort of shifting your strategy to other countries to be less a victim of Trump policy. In Japan, the recent election reignited this debate. So we've seen that Prime Minister Ishiba is under pressure, still negotiating tariffs with Trump. Same case here. President Lee Jae-myung is still negotiating, and we'll hope to see maybe a deal before August 1st for both countries. So this trend of should we go like more protectionist or keep going global? I think for now, the idea of a global world interconnected is still going strong. The US tried to impose this new world order of being sort of bargaining always and making deals one-to-one. But still now Korea and Japan and Asian countries are looking to better connect with other regions, being less dependent on the US. We'll see how far that can work, if it can work. But that will require a lot of negotiation with a lot of partners in the world.
Right, for sure. But we'll see some picture, I suppose, by August 1st then. All right, I'm afraid that's all the time we have. Celio, as always, thank you very much for your time and your thoughts. Walter, over in Tokyo, thank you so much for your insights today.
Thank you very much for having me.
Right, well, that is all the time we have for this edition of Press Perspective. We return same time tomorrow with a panel session on a number of national events here in South Korea. Do join us then.